Hey there, teachers, students. We're in the middle of August of 2021. It's August 11th. I'm in Portland, Oregon, and if you check the weather back then, it was a heat wave. It's just ramping up right now. I've got a public service heat wave warning on my phone. The town is, full of talk of the 100 plus degrees expected. But right now, in my office upstairs, it is not yet stifling. So I thought I'd talk about curriculum necklaces. What does that mean? It's when you're stringing together topics or readings into longer reading programs. It's like programming for television. What follows what? You've got your audience, you want some kind of segue. This stuff is not random. People who program for television, executives who do TV programming, especially, um, when there are really large audiences are involved, they have to think hard about what follows what and who's up against what. So there's kind of that competition. But there's also the metaphor of a necklace itself, which you've got in Bucky in spades, in that he's always pulling out this necklace and taking links out of it until he's down to a triangle. And that connotes also just graph theory and polyhedra and just connecting every which way. So really, when you're following along a polyhedron, edge, 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 going through hubs or vertices, you're in a way going along some necklace or other. You could think of a necklace as a multi-stop airline route between A and B, right? You got to change planes here and there. That's a curriculum necklace. So one of the necklaces, okay, there are two that I want to talk about here. Linking in Bucky as a transcendentalist, how problematic is that? For one thing, as I point out in this essay, the philosophy shop talks have largely not embraced transcendentalism as a thing, preferring to leave it in literature. So we don't read a lot of Emerson in getting a philosophy PhD, even though Nietzsche was an admirer of Emerson. It's kind of a jewel in the rough, not that well educated from Nietzsche's point of view, but really a role model for future philosophers. Therefore, Thus Spake Zarathustra has some resonance from Emerson, according to Nietzsche himself. So what I'm doing is going back to Margaret Fuller, who's part of this transcendentalist movement, which does have a lot of theology going on, in that Harvard at the time is coming to see the Bible, maybe you could say, from a more secular point of view, which is making waves. And Emerson quits the Unitarian Church and becomes, I would say, a philosopher. But he's kind of in a twilight zone, and the Americans have somewhat disowned this immediate past centered around Boston and Concord and all this, and have gone back to the European sources for like a leftist dogmatics, say Marxism. And what Rorty's suggesting here, and this is like a segue or a necklace in achieving our country, is that we can well create a left that's not resting a lot of weight on the Marxist paradigm, because you know from Fuller how Marxism gets filed under neo-Darwinism or social Darwinism. You've got workers saying we're the most fit, and you've got owner managers saying we're the most fit, and both of them assume it's either or, and therefore there's a Malthusian paradigm encompassing both of them and making them both really survival of the fittest, social Darwinism, yada yada. It's not that they're that different, really. In other words, so-called communism and capitalism are flip sides of the same social Darwinist coin. And maybe we're not playing quite that language game, right? So we're going to reach back to our European heritage, but maybe we'll just bypass the Marxism a little more than you're used to, right? So there's that option, given where Bucky's coming from. Then another segue, I want to draw attention to Alan Potkin's Orwellian memory holes project. And it's quite esoteric because he is a scholar of religious art or just commemorative art, in other words, memorial art, in other words, keeping the historical record in terms of art is an ancient practice, but then comes the need or the desire to erase or make room for the new, right? It's kind of a combination of motives as to why people paint over old stuff. Partly, it may be to disown that old stuff and sink it into a memory hole. But now, with our modern digital equipment and so forth, it's quite possible to memorialize memorials. Like before we take them down, maybe in a fit of outrage, maybe we carefully preserve the original, for one thing. There's no reason to tear it down, put it in a museum. And number two, we can digitize all these paintings and things. So before people run amok and destroy heritage, nowadays we have much more capability to at least keep a backup, however primitive. Maybe enough of a backup to someday recreate something very close to the original. Maybe that's not a goal, and maybe we do have the original, it's just not visible. So memory holes, very important approach to history, because then you can start digging in them. You can start unearthing stuff that's been hidden on purpose a lot of the time. And that's kind of detective work, and it's a very interesting way to approach history. And there I would segue to this lecture, this one in particular, at University of Scranton by Stephen Kinzer, who spent at this point a lot of time researching the Dulles brothers. That's Allen and John Foster Dulles in U.S. history. One was the Department of State Secretary, you could say Secretary of State, and the other was the head of the CIA, and like one of the first ones, because that was a new organization. Truman kind of brought it into existence out of the OSS, kind of made it more formal and bureaucratic and so on, long history. But this lecture in particular starts and ends with memory hole stories about looking for a bust of John Foster Dulles at Dulles Airport, named for Dulles. Where's that bust that he saw in a newsreel Kennedy dedicating? Where is it now? And at the end of this talk, he's looking for a canvas, by a famous Mexican painter, and it's a political cartoon in a way. And where did it end up? And both stories are really good, and I won't recount them here. I want you to go see the lecture if you got the time. Because I'm curriculum chaining, right? I'm doing Alan Potkin's PDF, which I'm going to link to, and this lecture, right? What links them together? The topic of memory holes. So we're following a polyhedron, edge, hub, edge. Now where else do we want to go? Remember, we're talking about curriculum necklaces, and the other one, okay, that one was just linking Allen scholarship to John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, biographies and research and world history really, and really where Vietnam got started in a lot of ways. Because in this YouTube channel, where have we encountered Alan Potkin? We've encountered him in connection with water projects in Burma, in Myanmar, and Thailand. He's gone there, and we've talked about that. Look at the Sam Hill intro, and you'll get some of that. But also, Alan has been here in this channel, not in person, but I've recounted some of his research into what are called McNamara's morons or whatever. It's like people not qualified to be in war sent as kind of a last-ditch measure. And so we've talked about that a little bit. And again, social Darwinism. Where does foreign policy come from in this country? What is the psychology behind it? Now, lastly, I want to just say tonight is, if all goes well, it could be there's some issue because of an appointment I have, but we're going to do another class tonight, and I've really been, getting into what we would conventionally call calculus, delta calculus, Newton, Leibniz, and pulling out all the stops in terms of what we've learned up till now. In other words, this is a 10 or how many times do we meet? I'm not actually sure, but twice a week for quite a few weeks, maybe 10 weeks, maybe less. And it's kind of a low-key class. It's not homework intensive. It's not turn in a lot of work intensive. This is what high school math is contains. These are its topics, kind of as a preview, an overview. So I'm getting into the number e here and talking about its properties and differentiating it and using SymPy to take the derivative and seeing some cool, nicely formatted output and so on. This is free open source software that we're using, and we're previewing the sort of STEM curriculum of tomorrow where we use Jupyter notebooks and all those kind of things, right? So that's another big long thread in this channel, and that's another place where I jump over to Bucky Fuller to cross the bridge back to the humanities of sphere packing, the IVM. That's our bridge. The CP Snow bridge between the sciences and the humanities is sphere packing, and that gets us back to Bucky and back to the transcendentalism and back to all this sort of humanities curriculum that is more my focus in a lot of ways. So that's to catch you up on what we've been doing. I think a lot of people are pretty clear on the roadmap here and have a lot more stories I want to share, but hey, got to draw the line. Talk to you next video. Oh, one more thing. A concern raised when I talk about transcendentalism is are we going to go back to the dark ages of organized religion running things, like the times of Descartes, where he's like really afraid of church persecution ever since the case of Galileo cast a pall across Europe. Mercator was thrown in jail for a short time. It's like these were not fun times, and there's still bad memories of all that. And what does the Fuller syllabus seem to herald? And I bring up the Dalai Lama's project for India. I mean, his hopes. He's not in charge of India. He happens to live there. And he knows his history. He knows Buddhism. And he has his hopes and dreams for India. And he sees it as kind of a cauldron, the proverbial melting pot, where all the world religions come together. And if they could only agree on kind of a neutral, secularized space where all their wisdom could pour in without being a religious war, like, oh, our religion's better than yours and all that, right? Can we accomplish that? Because it somewhat seems to have failed in the Middle East, but India is bigger and older and has its own opportunities, as did and does South Africa and so on. It's like there are many melting pots in this world, the US, North America, Canada, where there's a high degree of mixed cultures altogether. And does that have to always be volatile, or can that be actually a very positive synergy, right? And of course, the rhetoric around the United States is it's a selling point. It's not a problem. It's a feature. So back to the Dalai Lama, he's hoping India, I guess you could say, would secularize along the lines of U.S. ideals in terms of separation of church and state and so on. Now, I don't know to what extent India consciously tries to separate church and state, but I would imagine that that's part of the rhetoric. So I'll follow the India threads another time when we get back to Tulsi Gabbard, perhaps. I can tell, upon listening to this Dulles Brothers recap, why Tulsi Gabbard is so against regime change wars, because she's from Hawaii in a kind of a deep way. I mean, Samoa, Hawaii, and she's from that part of the world where, the ugly dark side, I'd say, of imperialism really came to the foreground in, say, Hawaii, and hasn't really abated since then. Or maybe it has. Let's talk about it. That's what we're up to. Chat later.